The House Nobody Visited After Dark, a Miss Marple mystery. Chapter 1. The Lamp in the Window. The village of Little Hertsmere lay tucked between a bend of the River Ouse and the low chalk downs of Sussex, and in the summer of 1955 it possessed exactly one mystery worth speaking of, and that mystery had a name: Greymoor House. It was not, on the face of things, a remarkable building. A square Georgian front, ivy left to its own devices along the west wall, a garden that had once been formal and was now merely tenacious. What made it remarkable was its owner, Mr. Julian Thorncastle, who had lived there for 11 years without once, so far as anyone in the village could attest, inviting a living soul across his threshold after the sun went down. By day, Thorncastle was affable enough. He bought his tobacco from Mr. Rennick's shop and always had a pleasant word for the postmistress. He attended church at Easter and Christmas, contributed generously to the fete, and had once judged the marrow competition with what everyone agreed was admirable impartiality. But when dusk came down over the downs, the great iron gates of Greymoor swung shut, and a single lamp burned in the study window until well past midnight, and no one, not the vicar, not the doctor, not even old Mrs. Pruitt, who had kept house for 3 generations of Hertsmere gentry and considered it her right to know everyone's business, had ever been asked to stay for a drink after 6 o'clock. "It's not natural," said Mrs. Priscilla Danvers, pouring tea in her small sitting room on the High Street, where her old friend Miss Jane Marple sat with her knitting, the June sunlight falling warm across the carpet. "A man who won't have visitors after dark. What is he hiding, Jane?" "Perhaps nothing at all," said Miss Marple placidly, though her needles did not pause. "Or perhaps something so ordinary that he is ashamed of how ordinary it is. People assume mystery must conceal something dreadful. Very often it conceals only embarrassment." "You always say that," Priscilla said, "and you are always wrong, or always right, and I can never tell which until the end." Miss Marple had come to Little Hertsmere for what she described as a fortnight's rest, though her nephew Raymond privately suspected his aunt was incapable of resting anywhere for longer than it took a secret to surface. She had known Priscilla Danvers since their girlhood, when they had both been considered rather plain and rather clever, 2 qualities that the passing decades had not much altered. It was at the church fete held on the vicarage lawn on the 2nd Saturday in June that the shadow first fell, though no one recognised it as a shadow at the time. Mr. Thorncastle attended, as he always did, resplendent in a cream linen suit that made him look younger than his 61 years. He bought a pot of Mrs. Pruitt's damson jam, admired the Reverend Aldous Trenholme's prize dahlias, and spent a full 20 minutes in close conversation with Miss Verity Ashcombe, a young widow who had taken the cottage by the mill the previous autumn, and who had, in the estimation of every gossip in the village, caught Mr. Thorncastle's eye rather more thoroughly than any woman had managed in 11 years. "They say he means to marry her," whispered Mrs. Ogilvy, the draper's wife, to anyone who would listen. "Fancy, at his age." 61 is not so very old," said Miss Marple mildly, though she had not been addressed. Mrs. Ogilvy looked faintly startled, as people often did when Miss Marple joined a conversation uninvited, and then, recovering, said, "Well, old enough to know his own mind at any rate, though what she sees in him, shut up in that house every night like a hermit, I'm sure I don't know." It was also at the fete that Dr. Osgood Merrow, the village's general practitioner, was observed to draw Mr. Thorncastle aside near the refreshment tent, and the 2 men exchanged words that a passing curate described afterward as not entirely friendly, though he could not say what had been said, only that Dr. Merrow's face had gone the colour of old parchment, and that he had left the fete altogether not 10 minutes later. Miss Marple, who had been sitting quite still beside the flower stall with the air of a woman entirely absorbed in her lemonade, had in fact observed the exchange with considerable interest. She noted that Dr. Merrow's hand had trembled as he lit a cigarette afterward, and that Mr. Thorncastle, for his part, had smiled. But it was, she thought, the smile of a man covering something rather than enjoying something. She said nothing of this to Priscilla that evening. It was, after all, none of her business, and the fete had been, by every outward measure, a pleasant success. The dahlias had won their ribbons. The tombola had raised £11 for the church roof, and Mr. Thorncastle had gone home to Greymore House as the light faded, past the tidy cottage where Mrs. Prentice kept a small silver-framed photograph dusted every morning and spoken of to no one, past the churchyard where the Reverend Trenholme's roses climbed the lich gate in a riot of early summer colour, his lamp burning as ever in the study window, and not one soul in Little Hartsmere imagined, watching that small, steady light against the darkening downs, that the quiet order of their parish was about to be tested a good deal more severely than any sermon had ever prepared it to be. It was the last ordinary evening Little Hartsmere would know for some time. That night, as on every night for 11 years, the great iron gates of Greymore House swung shut at precisely 6:30, their hinges giving a low, familiar groan that the villagers had long since stopped remarking upon, so thoroughly had it woven itself into the fabric of the evening, as much a part of Little Hartsmere's dusk as the rooks settling into the elms behind the churchyard, or the click of Mr. Rennick's shop bolt being drawn across for the night. Old Sam Gully, finishing his work among the roses, touched his cap to no one in particular and shuffled off toward his cottage on the Fenbridge Road. Mrs. Prentice, having left a cold supper laid and the kitchen scrubbed to her own exacting standard, cycled home along the lane with her basket empty and her mind, so far as anyone could later determine, on nothing more troubling than the price of butter. And within the house, as the June light lengthened into a soft golden dusk and then, gradually, into the deep blue dark of a country summer night, the lamp in the study window was lit, as it always was, and by all outward appearance, Julian Thorncastle settled into his customary solitary evening, a glass of whisky, a stack of correspondence, the low murmur of the wireless turned down to a whisper so as not to disturb Miss Soloway's early retirement, precisely as he had done on some 4,000 evenings before this one. No one in the village, going about the last small errands of a summer's day, thought to look twice at the lamp burning steady in that familiar window. It had burned there, after all, for 11 years, a small fixed point of light against the darkening downs, so constant and so unremarkable that its constancy had become, in its own quiet way, one of the village's most reassuring certainties. Proof, if proof were needed, that whatever else changed in the world beyond Little Hartsmere's boundaries, Mr. Thorncastle would be exactly where he always was, doing exactly what he always did, until morning came again. By midnight the lamp still burned. By 1 o'clock it burned still, and somewhere in the deep, unwitnessed hours between 1 and dawn, it burned on over a room that had, without any outward sign at all, become entirely silent. Chapter 2. What the Milkman Found. It was Constable Wilfred Boothby's considered opinion, given some years later to a nephew who asked him about it, that he had known something was wrong the moment he saw the milk bottles. 2 full bottles, standing untouched on the step of Greymore House, on the morning of the 18th of June, a Saturday, when Mr. Thorncastle, by long habit, brought his own bottles in promptly at 7, rain or shine, being a man of exacting routine. The milkman, young Tommy Alderson, had mentioned it to the constable in passing, more as an oddity than an alarm, but Boothby, a methodical man not given to fancy, had thought it worth a look. He found the front door unlocked, which was itself unusual, for Thorncastle was known to be careful about his locks. The hall was dim and silent. It was in the study, where the lamp still burned though the June morning was bright outside, that Constable Boothby found Julian Thorncastle, slumped forward across his own desk, one hand still curled loosely around an overturned glass, the smell of whisky mingling with something else, something bitter and faintly of almonds, hanging in the close air of the room. He was quite dead, and had been, the doctor would later estimate, for some 8 or 9 hours. By 9 o'clock the news had reached every corner of Little Hartsmere, carried on the tongues of the milkman, the postmistress, and Mrs. Pruitt, who happened to be crossing the green with a basket of eggs when Constable Boothby cycled past at speed toward the police house in Fenbridge, 3 miles off, to telephone for Inspector Reg Pollard. "Dead," said Mrs. Ogilvy, clutching her apron. "In that house, all alone, with nobody to help him. Didn't I always say there was something wrong about a man who never had visitors after dark? Didn't I say it?" "You did say it," Priscilla Danvers admitted to Miss Marple over a hastily abandoned breakfast, "though I don't recall you meaning it quite like this." Miss Marple set down her teacup with the particular care she reserved for moments when her mind had begun, quietly and without fuss, to work. "Poison, I should think, from what the constable is saying about the smell in the room. Almonds generally mean cyanide, though arsenic and 1 or 2 of the alkaloids can produce something similar under the right conditions. It is never quite so simple as it sounds in detective novels, of course. Real poisons are messier and slower than fiction generally allows. Jane, you sound as though you find this interesting." "I find human nature interesting," said Miss Marple. "Death merely tends to bring it to the surface rather faster than a garden party does." By noon, Inspector Reg Pollard had arrived from Fenbridge, a broad, sandy-haired man of perhaps 45, capable and not unintelligent, but possessed of the particular impatience common to policemen who believe that the obvious explanation is usually the correct one, and who had, in fairness, generally found this to be true in a long career of burglaries, poaching, and the occasional public house brawl. Murder in Little Hartsmere was, to him, a novelty, and he approached it with the brisk confidence of a man determined not to be made a fool of by a case above his usual weight. "Poisoned his own whiskey by the look of it," Pollard told his sergeant, standing in the study amid the settling dust of fingerprint powder. "Question is whether he did it himself, or someone did it for him." The glass, when analysed, proved to contain a substantial quantity of potassium cyanide. The whiskey decanter on the sideboard, curiously, did not, which ruled out, as Pollard noted with some satisfaction, any theory that the poison had simply been introduced at source for whoever might help themselves. Someone had put the cyanide directly into Thorncastle's glass, and only his glass, on that particular evening. "Which means," said Pollard to Miss Marple, whom he encountered, "not entirely by accident, for she had a way of being wherever information was likely to surface. Outside the gates of Greymore House that afternoon, either the man dosed himself deliberately, or somebody who knew his habits very well indeed came into that house, poured the poison into that one glass, and left again, all without anybody in the village noticing a thing. Or," said Miss Marple, "somebody who was already inside the house when he poured his own drink." Pollard looked at her with the faint condescension of a professional addressing an amateur, tempered by the knowledge, for word of Miss Marple's reputation had reached even Fenbridge, that the amateur in question had a habit of being right. "That's assuming somebody was inside," he said, "and Thorncastle didn't have visitors after dark. Whole village will tell you that." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is rather the interesting part, don't you think? A man who saw no one after dark for 11 years, and who was murdered, apparently, after dark, by someone who must have been very familiar indeed with his household, familiar enough to know which glass was his, and precisely when to act. It does rather suggest, Inspector, that no visitors and no one in the house are not quite the same thing." Chapter 3. The Coroner's Court. The inquest was held on the Wednesday following the discovery, in the small assembly room above the Fenbridge post office that served, on the rare occasions such formalities were required, as the district's coroner's court, a cramped, high-windowed chamber that smelled perpetually, whatever the season, of dust and old varnish. and which had, on this particular morning, filled to a capacity it had not seen since a disputed will, some 6 years before, had brought half of 2 neighbouring parishes out to watch the proceedings. Miss Marple secured a seat near the back, beside Priscilla, and observed the gathering with the same quiet attentiveness she had brought to the fete some days before, for an inquest, she had long believed, revealed a great deal about the true temper of a community, quite apart from whatever facts it was formally convened to establish. Dr. Merrow, called to give evidence of the medical circumstances, testified with a steadiness that surprised those who had heard the rumours of his agitation at the fete, describing in careful clinical language the symptoms consistent with cyanide poisoning and the estimated time of death, somewhere between 9:30 and midnight. He judged, though he was careful, under questioning from the coroner, to qualify this estimate with the proper professional caution, noting that the precise hour could not be fixed with certainty given the conditions in which the body had been found. The coroner, a dry, precise man named Mr. Aldous Ferraby, who had presided over the Fenbridge district for the better part of 2 decades, and had grown, in that time, thoroughly unimpressed by drama of any kind, took Constable Boothby through his discovery of the body with methodical patience, and heard Inspector Pollard's preliminary account of the investigation with the air of a man ticking items off a familiar list. It was Miss Soloway's testimony that drew the room's closest attention. She gave it in a low, controlled voice, describing the household's ordinary evening routine, her own retirement at 9:30, and her discovery, the following morning, that Mr. Thorncastle had not come down to breakfast, a circumstance sufficiently unusual, given his regular habits, that she had gone herself to the study and found Constable Boothby already there before her, summoned by the milkman's report. "You heard nothing unusual in the night?" the coroner asked. "Nothing, sir. The house is old, and the walls thick. I have known Mr. Thorncastle to receive a telephone call at 11 at night and conduct a 20-minute conversation without my hearing a word of it from my own room." Miss Marple noted, with the particular attention she brought to such small human details, that several of the jurymen glanced toward the public gallery as the evidence unfolded, toward Dr. Merrow in particular, whose reputation for debt had by then travelled the length of the district, and toward Miss Soloway, whose composed testimony seemed, to more than one watching face, rather too composed for a woman who had lived so many years under the same roof as a murdered man. It was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely the sort of unspoken verdict a village reaches long before any coroner's jury troubles to deliberate, and precisely the sort most likely to prove wrong. The jury, 7 local men drawn from the district's tradesmen and farmers, returned, after a retirement of scarcely 20 minutes, a verdict of murder by person or persons unknown, a formula that satisfied no one in the room half so much as it satisfied the coroner himself, whose business, after all, was only to establish that a crime had occurred and not to solve it. "A person or persons unknown," Miss Marple repeated afterward, as she and Priscilla made their way down the narrow staircase and out into the Fenbridge High Street, crowded now with departing spectators, exchanging fresh theories with every step. "It has a certain honesty to it, that phrase, don't you think? An admission that the law, for all its careful procedure, does not yet know what a good many people in this room believe, quite privately, that they already do. And what do you believe, Jane?" "I believe," said Miss Marple, "that we have heard a great deal of evidence this morning about what happened, and almost nothing at all about why. And it is the why, my dear Priscilla, that generally points the surest way to the who." Chapter 4. A great deal of talk and very little sense. By the Sunday following the discovery, the village had, in the manner of small communities everywhere, confronted with a genuine sensation, produced no fewer than 6 fully formed theories, each held with an absolute conviction, entirely unsupported by evidence. At the greengrocer's, It was confidently asserted that Thorncastle had taken his own life over some unspecified financial ruin, though no one could quite explain why a man facing ruin would first purchase a pot of prize-winning jam at a village fête with every appearance of contentment. At the Bell and Hare, where the men of the village gathered of an evening to discuss matters of importance over their pints, the prevailing view held that a burglar had been surprised at his work and had panicked, a theory that founded rather badly on the fact that nothing whatsoever appeared to be missing from Greymore House, and that burglars, in the general run of things, did not customarily carry vials of cyanide about with them on the off chance of being disturbed. Mrs. Ogilvy, predictably, had the most elaborate theory of all, involving foreign agents, the war, and a suggestion, repeated to at least 4 separate customers over the course of a single morning at the draper's, that Mr. Thorncastle had known things he oughtn't. Though pressed for particulars, she could produce nothing more substantial than a meaningful look and the observation that a man who locked his gates every evening for 11 years running was hardly likely to have been an honest tradesman. The trouble with village gossip, Miss Marple remarked to Priscilla, as the two of them walked back from church past knots of villagers still trading theories over garden walls, is not that it is always wrong. Very often it contains a good deal of truth, buried among the fancy, rather like a needle in a quantity of hay. The difficulty is that no one troubles to look for the needle, because the hay itself is generally so much more entertaining. And have you found your needle yet, Jane? I have found several, Miss Marple admitted, pausing to admire Mrs. Trenholme's delphiniums with every appearance of a woman with nothing more pressing on her mind than horticulture. The trouble is persuading them to form themselves into a single thread, rather than half a dozen separate and contradictory ones. A lamp that burns every night without visitors, a doctor who turns the colour of old parchment at a friendly word, a young widow in mourning grey for a man she knew scarcely 8 months. These are all needles, my dear, but I do not yet know which of them, if any, was the one that pricked. It was left to Inspector Pollard, arriving at the police house that same Sunday afternoon, to find no fewer than 3 separate anonymous notes awaiting him, one accusing the gardener, one accusing a wandering tinker seen on the Fenbridge Road a fortnight previous, and one, written in a hand that was almost certainly Mrs. Ogilvy's despite its careful disguise, accusing Dr. Merrow of what the note delicately termed unprofessional conduct of a financial nature, to observe to his sergeant that a village's willingness to accuse its own neighbours, once given licence by a genuine crime, was a thing that never failed to astonish him, however many years he spent among small communities. A 4th note arrived by the evening post, this one unsigned and mercifully brief, suggesting only that the inspector ask Mrs. Prentice why she never speaks of her boy, a note Pollard read twice, set aside as one theory among a dozen equally unsubstantiated, and did not think of again for the better part of a fortnight, a lapse he would later regard, with some private chagrin, as the single greatest oversight of the entire investigation. "They'll settle down once we've an arrest," Sergeant Dexter offered. "They'll settle down," Pollard agreed grimly, "once we've the right arrest. Settle for the wrong one, and this village will be picking at the wound for a generation." Chapter 5. The Household at Greymore. Greymore House, it transpired over the following days, was not so solitary an establishment as village gossip had painted it. Thorncastle kept a small staff, a cook-housekeeper, Mrs. Ivy Prentice, who came in daily but slept at her own cottage, a gardener handyman, old Sam Gully, who was nearly deaf and rarely ventured past the potting shed, and, residing in the house itself, a companion secretary of some 15 years' standing, Miss Beatrice Soloway. It was Miss Soloway who had found nothing amiss the previous evening, having retired to her own room at 9:30, as was her custom, leaving Mr. Thorncastle, as he preferred, alone in his study with his lamp and his whisky and whatever correspondence occupied his solitary evenings. She was a thin, composed woman of perhaps 50, with iron-grey hair drawn back severely, and a manner that Inspector Pollard privately described to his sergeant as buttoned up tight as a hymn book. She sat very upright in the drawing-room's least comfortable chair, as though she had chosen it deliberately, and answered his questions precisely, without evident distress, which the inspector found either admirably controlled or faintly suspicious, and could not quite decide which. Mr. Thorncastle's habits were very regular, she told him, seated in the drawing-room with her hands folded in her lap. He dined at 7, retired to the study at 8:30, and remained there, generally, until midnight or later. He did not like to be disturbed. "And you didn't hear anything unusual last night? No visitors, no voices?" "None, Inspector, though I should say that the study is at the far end of the house from my room, and the walls at Greymore are thick. One might have a whole regiment marching through the hall and hear very little of it from the east wing." Miss Marple, who had contrived, through the simple expedient of bringing Mrs. Prentice a jar of Priscilla's gooseberry preserve as a gesture of neighbourly sympathy, to find herself briefly in the Greymore kitchen that same afternoon, formed rather a different impression of Miss Soloway from what she gathered in conversation with the housekeeper. 15 years she's been with him," Mrs. Prentice said, kneading bread with more force than the dough strictly required. "Come when his first secretary left to be married, and never left herself, though heaven knows she had chances. There was a solicitor in Lewes wanted to marry her, must be 10 years back now, and she turned him down flat. Devoted to Mr. Thorncastle she was. Some said too devoted, if you take my meaning, though I never held with that kind of talk myself." "And was Mr. Thorncastle aware of her devotion, do you think?" Mrs. Prentice paused in her kneading. "If he was, he never let on. Kind to her always, but kind the way you'd be kind to old furniture. Fond of it because it's always been there, not because you'd miss it particular if it went. And then this business with Mrs. Ashcombe started up this spring, and I did wonder—" She stopped herself, flushing slightly. "Well, it's not my place to wonder aloud, is it?" "I find," said Miss Marple gently, "that it is very often exactly the wondering that people stop themselves from saying aloud which turns out to matter most." Mrs. Prentice said nothing further on the subject, but her silence, Miss Marple thought, was in itself rather eloquent. There was, besides, the small matter of Sam Gully, whom Miss Marple encountered on her way out through the kitchen garden, bent over a row of runner beans with the placid concentration of a man for whom the great disturbances of the human world registered only as a distant weather system, scarcely worth looking up for. He was, Mrs. Prentice had explained, quite profoundly deaf, a legacy, it was generally understood, of some old injury from his own soldiering days, though he never spoke of the war himself, and no one in the village had ever pressed him on the point, deafness being, in a small community, a subject people learned early to work around rather than discuss. 40 years he's kept a garden somewhere or other, Mrs. Prentice said, watching him through the kitchen window with an odd, unreadable expression. Came to us the same year Mr. Thorncastle bought the house. Near enough. Good with his hands, better with growing things than with people, if you follow me. I don't suppose he's said above 24 words to me in 9 years, and most of those about Greenfly. He seems a solitary sort of man. Solitary, aye, but not unhappy with it, so far as I could ever tell, though— Mrs. Prentice paused, her hands going still over the bread dough for the second time that afternoon. "Though I did think, once or twice this past year, that something was troubling him rather more than usual. Short with the boy who comes to help with the heavy digging, which he never was before, kept to the far end of the grounds more than he used to, away from the house. I put it down to his age. He must be near 70 now, whatever he says, but I don't know that age was the whole of it." Miss Marple thanked her, gathered up her jar of gooseberry preserve, for she had after all come with a genuine gift, whatever use she made of the visit besides, and made her way back through the garden, past Sam Gully still bent over his beans, who touched his cap to her without looking up, in the automatic courtesy of a man who had learned to greet the world by feel rather than by conversation. She noted, without at that time understanding its significance, that his hands, though steady enough at their work, trembled very slightly when he straightened to watch her pass through the gate. The small, betraying tremor, she thought afterward, of a man carrying something a good deal heavier than a trowel. Chapter 6. A Widow at the Mill Cottage. The Mill Cottage stood at the quiet end of the village, where the lane narrowed and the sound of the weir carried faintly through open windows on a still afternoon. And it had about it, Miss Marple thought as she approached, the particular neatness of a household kept by a woman with more time than money and a great deal of pride invested in appearances, the small front garden weeded to the last inch, the brass work on the door polished to a shine that spoke of hours rather than minutes. Miss Verity Ashcombe received Miss Marple's call, arranged with the transparent pretext of borrowing a pattern for a knitted jumper, a pretext Miss Marple deployed with the shameless efficiency of long practice, with evident nervousness, though whether this stemmed from grief, guilt, or mere social unease was not immediately apparent. She was a handsome woman of perhaps 35, dark-haired, dressed with quiet good taste in mourning grey, though she had known Thorncastle only since the previous autumn, which spoke, Miss Marple thought, either to genuine feeling or to a very careful attention to appearances. "Everyone will say I only wanted his money," Mrs. Ashcombe said abruptly, setting down the tea things with a hand that was not quite steady. "I know they will. A widow, come from nowhere, taking up with the richest man in the village. I've heard it whispered already, though he's not a week dead." "People will say a great many things," Miss Marple observed, "very few of which are worth attending to. I am more interested, Mrs. Ashcombe, in what you actually felt for him." The directness of the question seemed almost to startle Mrs. Ashcombe into honesty. "I liked him," she said slowly, "better than liked, I think, though it's early days to be sure of such things. He was kind and funny in a dry sort of way, and he listened when I spoke, which is rarer in a man than you'd think. But there was something he wouldn't tell me, Miss Marple, something about himself. I asked him once, quite lightly, why he never had anyone to Greymore after dark, and his whole face changed, just for a moment, and then he laughed it off and said something about an old man's foolish habits, and I let it go, because one does, doesn't one, when a person one is fond of doesn't wish to answer." "Did you press him further, at any point?" "Once, 2 weeks ago, he'd asked me to marry him. Did you know that? I hadn't given him an answer yet, because I wanted to know him properly first, secrets and all, before I said yes to a man I'd only half met. I told him so. I said I couldn't marry a man who kept a whole room of himself locked away from me. He went very quiet, and then he said—" Mrs. Ashcombe's composure wavered for the first time. "He said, 'Verity, if I tell you, you may not want to marry me at all, but you deserve to choose with your eyes open, and I promise you shall have the truth of it before midsummer.' And I believed him. And now he's dead, and whatever it was, it's died with him, and I shall never know." Miss Marple, folding her hands over the pattern book she had never truly wanted, thought privately that this was almost certainly not so. Secrets of the kind that made a man's face change like that rarely died so conveniently with their keeper. More often, they simply changed hands, and became, in the process, considerably more dangerous. Chapter 7. The Doctor's Visit. Dr. Osgood Merrow's surgery stood at the eastern end of the High Street, its brass plate polished each morning by a junior nurse who had held the position scarcely a year and who watched, with wide eyes, as Inspector Pollard's car drew up outside on the Monday following the murder, sensing correctly that whatever business had brought the police to her employer's door was unlikely to be the ordinary matter of a prescription renewed or a chest examined. Merrow was a heavy-set man of perhaps 55, with the flushed complexion of a man who enjoyed his port rather more than was good for him, and a manner that alternated, disconcertingly, between bluff good humour and sudden, watchful defensiveness. "Words with Thorncastle at the fete?" he said, when Pollard raised the matter. "I don't recall anything of the sort worth mentioning, Inspector. We may have discussed the weather, or the church roof fund. I really couldn't say. A witness describes you as looking rather shaken afterward, Doctor. White as a sheet was the phrase used." Merrow's jaw tightened. "I am a doctor, Inspector, not an actor. My complexion does what it likes without my leave." Pollard, who had encountered enough evasive witnesses in his career to recognize the particular quality of this evasion, did not press the point directly, but noted it, and continued his questions with the patient persistence of a man building towards something. It was Miss Marple, calling on Dr. Merrow the following afternoon under the entirely genuine pretext of a troublesome knee, who obtained rather more. "You knew Mr. Thorncastle a long while, I believe," she said, as the doctor examined her knee with more attention than it strictly required, being a woman who understood that doctors, like everyone else, relaxed when engaged in familiar work. 11 years, since he came to the village. It must have been you who attended him then, in all that time. One forms impressions of a man, doesn't one, over so many years of professional acquaintance. Merrow straightened, and something in his face closed like a door. "I don't discuss my patient's affairs, Miss Marple, living or dead. It wouldn't be right." "No," Miss Marple agreed placidly. "It wouldn't. Though I did wonder, Dr. Merrow, whether it was Mr. Thorncastle's affairs you were protecting at the fete, or your own. You seemed a good deal more shaken than a man discussing someone else's secrets generally is." The doctor's hands, Miss Marple noted, had gone quite still upon her knee. "I don't know what you mean. I think perhaps you do, but I shan't press you, Doctor. I am an old woman with a bad knee, not a policeman, though I would observe that Inspector Pollard is considerably less patient than I am, and considerably more willing to make his suspicions public if he does not receive satisfaction privately. It is generally wiser, in my experience, to give the truth to someone who will treat it gently before it is taken from you by someone who won't." Merrow said nothing further that afternoon, but 2 days later he presented himself at the police house in Fenbridge and asked to speak to Inspector Pollard alone. He came, Sergeant Dexter noted afterward, on his bicycle rather than in his motor, and left it leaning untidily against the police house wall, in a manner quite unlike his usual careful habits. A small detail, but one that suggested to the sergeant, who fancied himself something of a student of human nature since his elevation to plainclothes work, a man whose ordinary composure had been rather thoroughly abandoned somewhere along the 3-mile ride. "I've come to make a clean breast of it," Merrow said, once seated across the narrow table in the interview room, his big hands folded before him with the studied stillness of a man forcing them to behave. "Before your Miss Marple does it for me, and makes it sound a good deal worse in the telling than it is, however carefully she means it. Though I don't suppose it can be made to sound much better, whoever tells it. I'd rather hear it plain, Doctor, from the man who knows it best." "Plain, then." Merrow drew a long breath. "I have been in Thorncastle's debt these 8 years, as I told the old lady, and it is every bit as ugly as it sounds. But I want it understood, Inspector, that whatever unkind things were said between us at that fete, they were the words of a desperate and rather drunk man. I'd had 2 large brandies before I ever went near the refreshment tent, which is not an excuse, only an explanation, and not the words of a man who had it in him to do murder over them. I have never in my life administered so much as an overdose of aspirin to a patient I disliked, Inspector, and God knows I have disliked a good many of them." Chapter 8. A Debt of Long Standing. What Dr. Merrow told Inspector Pollard, and what emerged, somewhat abbreviated and considerably softened, into village knowledge over the following days, was this. Osgood Merrow owed Julian Thorncastle a very great deal of money. The debt had begun 8 years earlier, a matter of poor investments and worse luck at the card table in Brighton, compounded, if the whispers were to be trusted, by a fondness for the horses that Merrow had never quite managed to master. Thorncastle, approached in confidence by a doctor facing ruin and the loss of his practice, had lent the money privately, without interest, without a note of hand, on nothing but a gentleman's understanding. "He never once pressed me for it," Merrow told Pollard, his bluster entirely gone now, replaced by something rather more like shame. "Not in 8 years. But at the fete I'd had a rough month. Bad month at the tables again, I'm not proud of it. And I asked him for more. And for the first time he said no. Said he thought it was time I stood on my own feet, and perhaps looked at what the borrowing was doing to me. Kindly meant, I dare say, but it didn't feel kindly at the time. I said some things I regret, about what people would think of a man who lent money like that, so free and easy, to a doctor who could be made to feel he owed him more than money." Pollard let the silence sit a moment before pressing further, a technique he had found, over the years, generally more productive than any direct question. "You said at the fete, Doctor, meaning there was more said than the village has yet heard." Merrow's flush deepened. There was words exchanged, yes. Heated ones, on my side more than his. I'd had rather more to drink than I ought, and Thorncastle had just refused me an advance I badly needed, and a man says foolish things when he's cornered by his own debts in front of half the village, even a man who ought to know better. "Did you threaten him, Doctor?" "Not in so many words, but I may have said, I may have implied, that people would wonder why a man was so generous with his secrets kept so close, that if I went under, I might not go quietly, and might start wondering aloud about what a man really does behind locked gates after dark." Merrow put his head in his hands. "I didn't mean it as more than the ravings of a desperate man, Inspector. I swear it, and I never went near Greymore that night. I was at the Fenbridge card room until well past 11. A dozen men will swear to it." Pollard confirmed the alibi within the day. Merrow's account of his whereabouts held, corroborated by 5 witnesses at the Fenbridge establishment, none of whom had reason to lie for him. But the exchange left Pollard, and more particularly Miss Marple, who received the substance of it from Priscilla, who had it from Mrs. Prentice, who had it from the doctor's own housekeeper, with a question that would not quite settle: what secret, precisely, had Merrow been threatening to expose? A man does not generally accuse his benefactor of hiding something behind locked gates, unless he has some notion of what that something might be. When Pollard put this question to Merrow directly, the doctor's answer was, in its way, more unsettling than any confession. "I don't know, Inspector, and that's God's truth. I only knew there was something. A man doesn't shut his house up like that, year after year, for no reason at all. I said it to wound him, because I was desperate, not because I had proof of anything. But I'll tell you this, whatever it was, I think it frightened him rather more than a debt from a drunk of a doctor ever could." Pollard left the surgery that afternoon, with the uneasy sense, which he confided to no one but his own notebook, that he had crossed one name off his list of suspects, only to discover that the list itself was a good deal longer and a good deal stranger than he had first supposed. Chapter 9. The Letter in the Bureau. It was Inspector Pollard's sergeant, a careful young man named Dexter, who found the letter tucked into the false bottom of a small mahogany bureau in Thorncastle's bedroom, a hiding place so obvious, Miss Marple would later remark, that it was a wonder it had taken the police 3 days to think of looking there, though she was too well-mannered to say so to the inspector's face. The letter was unsigned, undated, and had evidently arrived by post some 6 weeks before the murder, judging by the postmark still faintly visible on the torn envelope found beside it. It read, in its entirety, "I know who you really are. I have known for some time, and I have said nothing, because I judge the man you have become worth more than the man you once were. But that judgment costs money to maintain, and I find myself in want of it. £50, left beneath the 3rd flagstone of the garden path nearest the old well, by the last day of June, and I shall continue to say nothing. Fail me, and little Heartsmere shall learn precisely who has been living amongst them these 11 years. There was no signature, and no distinguishing mark upon the paper itself, beyond a common enough brand sold at the stationer's in Fenbridge and, so far as could be established, at a dozen other shops besides across 3 counties of the south. The hand was blocky and deliberately disguised, each letter formed with the careful, unnatural evenness of someone labouring to prevent recognition, which told Pollard, at least, that whoever had written it possessed a hand distinctive enough, in its ordinary form, to be recognised by its recipient, a detail that would prove, in time, rather more useful than the letter's contents alone. "The last day of June," Sergeant Dexter observed, peering over his superior's shoulder. "That's nearly a fortnight off yet from when he died. Whoever wrote it gave him time to pay," which he never did, Pollard said. "Or if he did, someone lifted the money before we ever got near that flagstone." He had, in fact, sent Dexter to examine the spot the very afternoon the letter was found, and the young sergeant had spent the better part of an hour on his knees among the roses, prying up flagstone after flagstone along the path nearest the old well, watched with silent, uncomprehending interest by Sam Gully from the far side of the vegetable garden, before conceding that whatever the flagstone had once concealed, it concealed nothing now. Pollard read the letter through twice more, his face grim. "Blackmail," he said. "And not about the doctor's debts either. This is something older, something from before he ever came to this village." "Who you really are," Miss Marple repeated quietly. When Pollard, now considerably more inclined to consult her than he had been a week before, showed her the letter that evening in Priscilla's sitting room. "That is a very particular phrase, Inspector. Not what you have done, but who you are. It suggests, does it not, that Mr. Thorncastle was not entirely who he claimed to be, that Julian Thorncastle, of Greymore House, 11 years a resident of Little Heartsmere, may not be the name he was given at his christening. You think he was living under a false name? I think it would explain a great deal. The locked gates after dark, when he might be recognised by lamplight through an uncurtained window by someone with a memory for faces. The refusal to have visitors in the evening, when conversation runs longest and questions come most freely, aided by wine. Even his reluctance to tell Mrs. Ashcombe the truth before he married her. A man does not fear his own past so thoroughly unless the past in question is one the law, or society, would take a very dim view of. "Desertion," said Pollard slowly, "or worse. Fraud, embezzlement. A man doesn't change his name for nothing." "No," Miss Marple agreed, "he does not. And I think, Inspector, that we ought now to discover who Julian Thorncastle was before he became Julian Thorncastle. And, more urgently, who in this village discovered that secret before he did." Chapter 10. Somerset House and a Regiment's Roll. It took the better part of a week in which Little Heartsmere buzzed with theories ranging from the plausible to the wildly improbable, one enterprising rumour holding that Thorncastle had been a Russian spy, before Inspector Pollard's inquiries to the War Office and to Somerset House began to bear fruit. Julian Thorncastle, it transpired, had first appeared in official records in the autumn of 1944, when he purchased Greymore House with funds transferred from a bank in Zurich, giving as his previous address a residence in Kenya that, upon investigation, proved never to have existed. No birth certificate under that name could be found in any register in England, Scotland or Wales, though Sergeant Dexter, dispatched to spend 2 tedious days combing through the relevant indices at Somerset House, reported that the search had at least the virtue of ruling out several dozen entirely innocent men who happened to share the name. No school records, no prior tax history, nothing at all before 1944. A man who had, in the most literal sense, come from nowhere, and who had, in 11 years of scrupulous respectability, never once given the smallest outward hint that his past would not bear the ordinary scrutiny a country solicitor might one day, however unlikely, be moved to apply to it. The bank in Zurich, when approached through the proper diplomatic channels, a process that took the better part of 4 days and consumed, Pollard confided to his sergeant, more of his patience than the whole of the investigation thus far, proved reluctant to release any but the barest particulars, citing the sanctity of its client's confidence, even where the client in question was demonstrably deceased. What little it did release confirmed only that the funds had originated from a family trust registered many years before the war, under a name the bank's representative declined, with maddening Swiss correctness, to disclose without a great deal more paperwork than Pollard had patience to arrange from a police house in rural Sussex. Which means, Pollard told Miss Marple, spreading the meagre findings across Priscilla's dining table with the air of a man both frustrated and fascinated, we're looking for whoever Thorncastle really was before the war ended, a man who had access to a great deal of money, and good reason never to use his own name again. It was Miss Marple, who had spent a quiet, useful afternoon with the vicar, Reverend Trenholme, whose predecessor had kept meticulous parish records, and whose own hobby, as it happened, was military history, who made the next discovery. There was a Captain Michael Verrill, she told Pollard, of the same regiment that was stationed near Salisbury in the early months of 1944, whose case the Reverend Trenholme recalled from a magazine article some years ago, a small scandal in military circles, not widely publicized. Captain Verrill was accused of a serious dereliction of duty during an engagement in Italy, cowardice, in the plainest terms, though the official record uses gentler language, resulting in the deaths of several men under his command. He was to face court-martial, and then, before proceedings could begin, Captain Verrill disappeared entirely and was presumed, after some months, to have died attempting to cross into neutral territory. His family never received a body. You think Thorncastle was this Verrill, faked his own death and started again under a new name? I think it is a possibility well worth investigating, Inspector. A man with access, through family or connections, to funds abroad. A man with excellent reason never to be recognized by anyone from his old life. A man who would go to considerable lengths, locked gates, no visitors after dark, 11 years of careful solitude, to ensure that no old comrade, home on leave or settled nearby, might ever chance to see his face by lamplight and know him. Pollard sat back in his chair, turning the theory over. If it's true, it answers the blackmail letter, but it doesn't tell us who wrote it. Verrill's old regiment could be scattered across half of England by now. No, Miss Marple agreed. But I think, Inspector, that we need not look quite so far afield as a scattered regiment. I think whoever wrote that letter is very likely someone who has been close to Mr. Thorncastle for a very long time indeed, close enough to have recognized him gradually, over years, rather than in one sudden flash of memory. And that, I am afraid, narrows the field a good deal more than either of us might like. Chapter 11. A Photograph in an Old Frame. It was in the small hours that Miss Marple's mind, which rarely rested even when her body did, returned to a detail she had noted on her very first visit to the Greymore kitchen, and had not, until now, thought significant. Above the mantel in Miss Soloway's private sitting-room, a room Miss Marple had glimpsed only briefly, through a half-open door, while waiting for Mrs. Prentice to fetch a jar for the gooseberry preserve, there had hung a small photograph in a silver frame, a young officer in uniform, standing beside a woman who might, judging by the set of her shoulders and the sharpness of her chin, even at that youthful remove, have been a much younger Beatrice Soloway. It was, Miss Marple realized with the particular clarity that comes at 4 in the morning, an image entirely inconsistent with the story Mrs. Prentice had told her, that Miss Soloway had come to Thorncastle's employ only after his first secretary left to marry, some 3 years after his arrival in the village. If the photograph showed what Miss Marple now suspected it showed, then Beatrice Soloway's connection to Julian Thorncastle predated Greymore House altogether. It predated, perhaps, the name itself. It was a small thing, that photograph, and she had very nearly overlooked it entirely, so brief had been her glimpse of Miss Soloway's private sitting room, and so unremarkable, on the surface, did a woman of that age keeping an old wartime photograph appear. Half the households in England kept such photographs, propped on mantels and tucked into drawers, mementos of a decade that had touched every family in the country in one fashion or another. It was only the particular set of the young woman's shoulders in the image, the sharpness of her chin, that had lodged itself in Miss Marple's memory and refused, over the following days, to be dislodged, until at last, lying awake in the small hours, as was so often her habit when a case had not yet settled itself properly in her mind, she understood why it troubled her. It did not match the story she had been told. She said as much to Inspector Pollard over an early breakfast the following morning, and watched his face change as the pieces began, visibly, to settle into place. "Soloway," he said slowly. "She was with the same regiment? A nursing sister, perhaps, or a signals clerk. Women did serve close to those units, in the right role." "I believe further inquiry may confirm it," said Miss Marple. "But consider, Inspector, what it would mean if she did. A woman who knew Michael Verrill before he became Julian Thorncastle. A woman who followed him, or found him, or was found by him, and who has kept his secret faithfully for 15 years, asking nothing in return but to remain close to him, his companion, his confidant, the only person in that great house who saw him each evening after the gates were locked and the world shut out. And then, this spring, a young widow arrives in the village, and the man she has protected so long and so faithfully begins to fall in love with someone else. You think Soloway wrote the blackmail letter against the man she'd protected for years? That, Miss Marple admitted, is where the theory grows more difficult, Inspector, because it does not entirely fit. A woman who has kept a secret for 15 years out of devotion does not generally choose the 16th to threaten its exposure for £50. That motive belongs to someone with a need for money, and Miss Soloway, so far as we know, has none. I think it far more likely that the letter came from elsewhere entirely, and that its arrival, its proof that the secret was no longer safely hers alone to guard, was the very thing that set in motion whatever happened in that study on the night Mr. Thorncastle died. Chapter 12. The Confrontation in the Rose Garden. Inspector Pollard, armed now with a working theory and a name to test it against, called at Greymore House that same afternoon and asked to speak with Miss Soloway alone. Miss Marple, invited, with a degree of professional generosity Pollard would later attribute to his own growing respect for her methods, though he would never quite admit as much aloud, accompanied him, and it was in the rose garden behind the house, amid blooms that Thorncastle himself would never see flower fully, that the truth began, reluctantly, to surface. "Yes," Miss Soloway said, when Pollard laid the photograph before her, her composure cracking at last, along lines that had clearly been under strain for a very long time. "Yes, I knew him before. I was a signals clerk attached to his unit in Italy. I knew Michael Verrill, the real Michael Verrill, not the man this village thinks it buried. I knew what happened at Monte Rossano, and I knew it was not cowardice, whatever the official report said. I knew he froze because he had watched his own brother die in the same fashion not 3 months before, in the same kind of assault, and something in him simply broke. It was not cowardice, it was grief that had nowhere left to go. And you followed him, after he disappeared. I found him. It took 2 years, and a great deal of quiet inquiry, but I found him, living under a false name in a rented room in Bristol, half-starved and entirely without hope. I told him I would say nothing, that I understood, better than any court-martial ever could, what had happened to him and why. I helped him arrange the funds his family still controlled, helped him find this house, helped him build the life of Julian Thorncastle from nothing at all. And I have loved him, Inspector, every day of the 15 years since, and he never once knew it, because I judged, Rightly, I still believe that a man rebuilding himself from the ashes of his own disgrace had no need of a woman's inconvenient devotion on top of everything else he carried. Then you didn't write the blackmail letter? I did not. I would have died before I threatened him with the very thing I had spent 15 years protecting. Her voice, for the first time, trembled, and she pressed a gloved hand briefly against her mouth, as though to hold something back that had been held back a very long while already. Do you understand what it is, Inspector, to build your whole life around the safekeeping of another person's secret? I never married. I never allowed myself to think of marrying. Not truly, not once in 15 years, because I could not imagine handing my evenings to any man other than the one who needed me to be silent for him. And now he is dead, and the secret is out regardless, and I find I do not even have the comfort of believing my sacrifice preserved anything at all. Miss Marple, who had said very little throughout the exchange, spoke now with great gentleness, setting aside for a moment the careful, probing questions that had brought them to the rose garden in the first place. It preserved him, Miss Soloway, for 15 years that he would not otherwise have had. 15 years in which he built a respectable life, judged a marrow competition, contributed to a church roof, and was, by every account I have gathered in this village, generally regarded as a kind and decent man. That is not nothing. Whatever ended it in the end, you gave him that much. Miss Soloway did not answer at once. She looked out across the rose garden at blooms that had been planted. She said quietly after a moment, at her own suggestion some 6 years before, because Thorncastle had once mentioned, in an unguarded moment, that his mother had kept roses very like them, in a garden he had not seen since before the war. But I believe I know who did, she said at last. Chapter 13. The Gardener's Silence. The name Miss Soloway gave was not, as both Pollard and Miss Marple had half expected, Dr. Merrowes, his debts, and his desperation notwithstanding, but old Sam Gully, the nearly deaf gardener who had tended the grounds of Greymore House for all 11 years of Thorncastle's residence there, and whom nobody, in the whole course of the investigation thus far, had thought to question with any seriousness at all. He was in Italy too, Miss Soloway said. I only learned it myself, quite by chance, some 3 years ago, a photograph he kept in his potting shed, of a unit I recognised. He never spoke of it, and I never pressed him, because I assumed, as I assume you are assuming now, that if he had recognised Mr. Thorncastle, he would have said something long before this. But Sam Gully is a proud man, Inspector, and a poor one, and his daughter, did you know he has a daughter, in Brighton, with a sick child and a husband out of work, has been in considerable difficulty this past year. The potting shed, when Miss Marple reached it, proved a small, orderly kingdom entirely its own. Tools ranged along one wall with military precision, seed packets sorted by month of sowing in a series of wooden boxes that had clearly been labelled by a hand taking real pride in the labour, and, propped in one corner where the light fell best, an old photograph in a cracked leather frame that Miss Marple noted with quiet interest before she ever spoke a word to its owner, a row of young soldiers in the loose khaki of an earlier campaign, squinting into a foreign sun. It was Miss Marple, walking down to the potting shed that same afternoon while Pollard arranged for a proper interview, who found Sam Gully among his seed trays, and who approached the old man with the particular gentleness she reserved for those she judged to be more frightened than guilty. You needn't shout, she told him, when he cupped a hand to his ear in the automatic gesture of the long deaf. I shall write it down if it's easier. And she did, on a leaf torn from her small notebook. I know about the letter. I do not think you meant him harm, but a man is dead, and I think you had better tell someone the truth before silence does you more damage than honesty ever could. Gully read it twice, his weathered face working through something that looked, to Miss Marple's practised eye, very much like relief at being, at last, unburdened. I never meant him dead, he said, his voice the flat, over-loud register of a man who could not properly hear his own speech. God's truth, I never did. I recognized him the second year I worked here. Same face, thinner and greyer, but the same, and I'd served under him myself, before Monte Rossano, and I never thought him a coward, whatever the record said. I said nothing all these years out of respect for a man I still believed was a good one at heart. But my Nancy's boy needed an operation the doctors here couldn't give him, needed money I didn't have and couldn't borrow, and I thought, £50 from a rich man who owed his whole comfortable life to my silence. It seemed no crime at all. I never meant to ruin him. I only meant to ask for what I thought, God forgive me, he owed me. Did you collect the money? Never got the chance. He never left it under the flagstone. The date came and went, and nothing. I was working up the courage to ask him outright, man to man, the very week he died. I swear before God, Miss Marple, I never went near that house after dark in my life. I can't see well enough after dusk to find my own front door, let alone another man's study. It was, Miss Marple reflected as she thanked him and made her way back up the garden path, a confession that answered a great many questions and yet left the central one. Who, precisely, had entered Julian Thorncastle's study on the night of the 18th of June and poured cyanide into his glass, while Beatrice Soloway slept at the far end of the house, entirely, frustratingly, unanswered still. Chapter 14. A Second Letter. It was 2 days later, while the village digested the news of Sam Gully's confession with the particular relish reserved for scandals involving people one had always considered entirely beyond suspicion, that Mrs. Prentice the housekeeper, turning out the study for what she described as a proper clean, now the police are done poking about, found a second letter, this one never sent, tucked half-finished into the blotter of Thorncastle's desk, in his own unmistakable hand. My dearest Verity, I have put off this confession too many times, and I find, now that midsummer draws near and I have promised you the truth of it, that the words are harder to set down than I imagined. I am not the man you believe me to be. My name was not always Thorncastle. I was, once, a soldier who failed the men under his command, in the worst way a soldier can fail them, and who has spent 11 years since building a decent life out of the ruins of a disgraceful one. I do not know if you can love a man who was once a coward, even if he has spent every day since trying to become something better. But I would rather you know the truth and refuse me than marry a lie, and so I write to tell you. The letter ended there, mid-sentence, the ink slightly smeared as though the pen had been set down in haste or interrupted. He was going to tell her that very night, Miss Marple said, studying the unfinished lines with a stillness that Inspector Pollard, by now well accustomed to her methods, recognized as the outward sign of considerable inward activity. The 18th of June. Was that not close to the date he promised her the truth before midsummer? I think, Inspector, that Mr. Thorncastle sat down that evening intending, at last, to finish this letter, or perhaps to go to Mrs. Ashcombe directly and confess in person. And I think someone in that house knew it and could not bear what the confession would mean. Soloway, Pollard said. If he confessed to Mrs. Ashcombe and married her, Soloway loses him for good. 15 years of devoted secrecy, thrown over for a woman who's known him less than a year. It is the obvious reading, Miss Marple agreed, setting the unfinished letter down upon the desk, with the careful precision she brought to all things she judged important. And I confess, I am not yet entirely certain it is the wrong one. There is a great temptation, Inspector, in any case of this kind, to settle upon the reading that presents itself most readily, particularly when it fits so neatly with what has gone before. Miss Soloway had motive and opportunity in equal measure, and a heart that had been quietly breaking, by her own admission, for a very long time. It would be the tidiest of solutions, and tidiness is a most seductive quality in a murder investigation, quite as seductive, in its own way, as it is in a garden. One wishes so much for the roses to grow exactly where one has planned them. But I would ask you to consider, Inspector, one small detail that has troubled me since the beginning, and which I do not think we have yet given sufficient weight. Which is the whiskey glass, Inspector. Only his glass was poisoned, not the decanter, which anyone with access to the house might have tampered with at any hour of the day, but the specific glass, at the specific moment he poured his own drink that evening. That requires not merely knowledge of his habits, but presence in that room at the precise time he was pouring. And Miss Soloway has told us, quite plainly and I believe quite truthfully, that she retired at 9:30 and never went near the study again that night. If she is telling the truth about that, and I begin to think she is, then someone else was in that study with him, someone he trusted enough to admit after the gates were locked. Someone, Inspector, who was not Beatrice Soloway at all. Chapter 15. The Vicar's Recollection. It was the Reverend Aldous Trenholme, a mild, scholarly man whose interest in military history had already proved useful to the investigation once, who supplied, quite unwittingly, the detail that turned Miss Marple's suspicions in an entirely new direction. "I called on Thorncastle myself, you know, on the evening he died," the vicar told Miss Marple, over tea in the vicarage garden, with the faint air of a man only now realizing the significance of something he had mentioned to no one. "Not after dark, of course. I knew his habits as well as anyone, but at perhaps 6:45, before his dinner, about a small matter of the church roof subscription. He seemed distracted, preoccupied. I recall thinking he looked like a man bracing himself for something unpleasant. Was he alone when you called?" Miss Soloway was there, in the hall, taking his coat as he came in from the garden. "But there was someone else, too. I saw a car turning out of the drive as I arrived, a small green motor, though I couldn't say whose. I assumed it was a tradesman, or perhaps Dr. Merrow paying an early call, and thought nothing further of it." Miss Marple set down her teacup with great care. "A green motor, Reverend, would you say? And I ask this only because memory for such details is so often more reliable than we credit it. Would you say the car might have belonged to Mrs. Ashcombe?" The vicar considered, his brow furrowing with the particular effort of a man unaccustomed to being asked to recall details rather than doctrine. "Now that you mention it, yes, I believe it might very well have been hers. I have seen her drive past the vicarage in just such a car more than once this spring, generally of a Sunday afternoon, on her way to visit. Well, I hardly need say where she was visiting, Miss Marple, given all that has come out since. And Mr. Thorncastle himself, when you spoke with him that evening, did he give any indication of what had passed, or was about to pass, between them?" "None in words," the vicar said slowly, "though I recall now, thinking on it as you ask me to, that he seemed a man bracing himself for something rather than a man who had already faced it and come through. Composed, but with an edge of strain about him, like a fiddle string tuned a shade too tight. I put it down at the time to some difficulty over the roof subscription, which I am now rather ashamed to have imagined was the whole of his troubles that evening." Miss Marple walked the length of the lane twice more before she reached the vicarage gate, turning the small fact over as carefully as she might have turned a stitch that had gone unaccountably wrong somewhere in a row of otherwise even knitting, searching for the point at which the pattern had first begun to slip. A green motor, glimpsed only in passing, by a man whose attention had been on his own errand rather than on the comings and goings of his parishioners. It was the sort of detail that a less patient investigator might have dismissed entirely, and yet Miss Marple had learned, over a great many years of quiet observation, that the details people mentioned almost apologetically, as though embarrassed to think them worth mentioning at all, were very often the ones that mattered most. It was a detail that, taken alone, meant little. Mrs. Ashcombe might have called at Greymore at 6:45 for any number of innocent reasons, and left again long before the gates were locked for the night. It was a detail that, taken alone, meant little. Mrs. Ashcombe might have called at Greymore at 6:45 for any number of innocent reasons, and left again long before the gates were locked for the night. But Miss Marple, turning the fact over as she walked back to Priscilla's house through the lengthening June evening, past gardens heavy with the scent of stocks and early roses, found herself troubled by something Verity Ashcombe herself had said, days before, in her cottage by the mill. "I told him I couldn't marry a man who kept a whole room of himself locked away from me. He said I should have the truth of it before midsummer." If Thorncastle had intended to confess that very evening, if he had, perhaps, begun the confession that afternoon, in person, only to be interrupted by the vicar's call before finishing it, then Verity Ashcombe might have been the very last person to speak with him before his household settled for the night. And a woman who had just learned that the man she loved, and had half agreed to marry, had once been branded a coward and had lived 11 years under a stolen name, might have reacted in any number of ways that neither grief nor guilt alone could fully explain. Chapter 16. What the Green Motor Carried confronted, gently but directly, by Inspector Pollard the following morning. Verity Ashcombe did not deny the visit, indeed, seemed almost relieved to admit it, as though the secret had been a weight she could no longer comfortably carry alone. "He telephoned me that afternoon and asked me to come," she said. "Said he had something he must tell me before he lost his courage entirely. I went at 6:45, as you say, and he told me everything. His real name, the court-martial, the 11 years of hiding. And I told him," her voice caught, "I told him it changed nothing. That I had guessed, more or less, that something of the kind lay behind his secrecy, and that a man who had spent 11 years trying to become better than his worst moment was worth 10 of a man who had never been tested at all. I told him I would marry him gladly, secret and all, and he wept, Inspector, a grown man of 61, weeping in his own drawing-room like a boy. I left at perhaps 6:30, before the vicar arrived, and I never saw him alive again. I did not poison him. I had no earthly reason to. He had just given me everything I had asked of him, and I had just given him everything he feared he could not have." Pollard, who had learned by now to test such accounts rather than simply accept them, found Mrs. Ashcombe's version corroborated, within the hour, by her housekeeper, who confirmed that her mistress had returned to the mill cottage well before 7, and had not left again that evening, being observed, in fact, by a neighbour walking her dog past the cottage windows at intervals throughout the night, the lamps burning steadily within. "Which puts her out of it," Pollard admitted to Miss Marple, with the particular frustration of a man who has just watched a promising theory dissolve. "And Merrow's alibi holds. And Gully can't see past his own nose after dark, by his own admission, let alone drive to Greymoor and back unnoticed. And Soloway swears she never left her room, which leaves us, Miss Marple, with a locked house, a poisoned glass, and not one single person left who had both the opportunity and the motive to have done it." "Not quite, Inspector," said Miss Marple slowly, a thought that had been forming uneasily at the very edge of her mind for some days now finally coming into focus with the particular clarity she associated, always, with a village woman many years before who had poisoned her husband's tea and very nearly gotten away with it, for the simple reason that everyone had been looking for a murderer with a motive, when the true motive had been hiding in the most ordinary of places. "I think, in fact, there is one person we have not yet properly considered at all, because we have been so occupied with what Julian Thorncastle concealed from the village that we have quite forgotten to ask what the village concealed from him." Chapter 17. Mrs. Prentice's Boy. It was a chance remark of Mrs. Ogilvy's, repeated to Priscilla Danvers over the draper's counter, and relayed to Miss Marple that same afternoon, with no sense whatsoever of its importance, that supplied at last the missing thread. "Did you know," Mrs. Ogilvy had said, folding a length of blue cotton, "that Ivy Prentice had a boy, years back, before she ever came to keep house for Mr. Thorncastle? Died in the war, poor thing, at that dreadful business in Italy everyone still whispers about, the one where the officer ran and left half his men to be slaughtered. She never speaks of it, of course. Wouldn't, would she?" "I never gave it a thought before," Priscilla admitted, somewhat abashed at her own incuriosity of 9 years' standing. "One doesn't like to ask, does one, about a thing so evidently painful, and Ivy Prentice has never been a woman to invite questions about herself. I only know it because Mrs. Ogilvy happened to mention it, and even she seemed to feel she was trespassing rather, in the telling. Miss Marple, hearing this second-hand from Priscilla that evening, sat very still for a long moment, and then asked, in a voice of great and careful gentleness, whether Priscilla happened to know the name of Mrs. Prentice's son. It took Inspector Pollard scarcely a day to confirm what Miss Marple had, by then, already guessed, that Ivy Prentice's only son, Private Thomas Prentice, had died at Monte Rossano in the same engagement that had broken Michael Verrill, Julian Thorncastle, beyond all recovery, one of the very men whose deaths had been laid, in the official record, at Verrill's door. Mrs. Prentice had come to Little Hartsmere from a village 40 miles distant some 9 years before, seeking, as she had told the previous owner of the position, a fresh start after hard times. She had taken the post as Thorncastle's housekeeper without, so far as anyone could establish, the least outward sign of recognizing her employer as the very officer whose cowardice, as she had believed it, all these years, on nothing but a government telegram's cold and impersonal phrasing, had cost her her only child. She recognized him, Miss Marple told Pollard, the two of them seated once more at Priscilla's dining table, the pieces of a long and painful puzzle laid out at last in something approaching their proper order. Not at once, I think. Perhaps not for a year or more. A face changes a great deal in the years between a young officer's photograph and a man of 50. But gradually, working in his house day after day, hearing him spoken of, seeing him close at hand, I think the recognition came, slow and terrible, and she said nothing, for 9 long years, because what, after all, could she do? Accuse a well-respected local gentleman on the strength of a resemblance and a mother's grief? She had no proof. She kept her silence and her position, and I think, in a dreadful way, she made herself watch him, day after day, living in comfort and respectability, while her boy lay in a foreign grave because of what she believed, wrongly, as we now know, but she could not have known that, was his commanding officer's cowardice. And then Merrow's threat at the fate, Pollard said slowly, and Gully's blackmail letter. She'd have heard the household gossip about both, working in that kitchen. She'd have known the secret was already unravelling, already close to the surface. And then, Miss Marple continued, Mrs. Ashcombe forgave him, told him, in that very house, on that very evening, that his cowardice, the thing that had cost Ivy Prentice her only son, changed nothing at all in her regard for him. I think Mrs. Prentice, preparing his dinner in the kitchen not 30 feet away, may very well have overheard some part of that conversation, or had it repeated to her by a servant's grapevine before the night was out. And I think that was the moment, Inspector, when 9 years of buried grief became at last something she could no longer simply carry in silence. Chapter 18. The Test in the Kitchen. Miss Marple's final test, for she had, by this point, formed a theory she believed correct in every particular but one, and that one particular she judged too important to leave to inference alone, was conducted not in a drawing-room, nor in a rose garden, but in the one place she judged Ivy Prentice would feel most entirely herself, and therefore most likely to betray, in some small unguarded gesture, the truth beneath her composure. She had spent the previous evening turning the theory over in every light she could bring to bear upon it, sitting long after Priscilla had gone up to bed, with only the ticking clock and her knitting for company, testing it against each fact the investigation had so far gathered, and had found, to her own quiet satisfaction and considerable sorrow, that it withstood every test she could devise. It explained the poisoned glass and not the decanter, for a housekeeper, unlike a stranger, might enter that study at any hour without exciting the least suspicion, and might easily contrive to be alone with the tray for the few seconds required. It explained why no one had seen a visitor arrive at Greymore after dark, For Ivy Prentice was no visitor, but a fixture of the house so familiar that her comings and goings excited no comment at all from anyone. And it explained, at last, the one detail that had troubled Miss Marple more than any other. That whoever had committed this murder had acted not with the cold premeditation of the blackmail letter, nor with the long, patient devotion of Beatrice Soloway's 15 years, but in a single, terrible moment of grief, finding, after 9 years of careful suppression, no further capacity for restraint. She arranged, through Mrs. Prentice's own evident pleasure in an appreciative audience for her baking, to call the following morning under the pretext of learning the recipe for the housekeeper's celebrated damson jam, the very jam Mr. Thorncastle had purchased at the fete on the last ordinary afternoon of his life. "You must have known him a long while," Miss Marple said, watching Mrs. Prentice's competent hands move among the jars, "to have understood his tastes so exactly. I understand you've kept house at Greymore some 9 years." "9 years this autumn," Mrs. Prentice agreed, not looking up from her work. "It is curious," Miss Marple went on, in the same mild conversational tone she might have used to discuss the weather, "how a household comes to know a man's habits so thoroughly after so many years. Which glass he prefers for his evening whisky, for instance, and precisely when he takes it. I imagine you could have walked into that study blindfolded, Mrs. Prentice, and known exactly where to find it. I dare say any housekeeper of 9 years' standing could say the same of her employer," Mrs. Prentice replied, her voice perfectly even, though her hands had resumed their stirring with a fraction more force than the fruit required. "It's the nature of the position, Miss Marple. One learns a gentleman's habits the way one learns the creak of his stairs, without ever meaning to, and without it signifying anything at all." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently, "not as a rule, though I have found, in a long life of observing households very like this one, that it is generally the habits we learn without meaning to that betray us most thoroughly, precisely because we have never thought to guard them." She paused, watching the older woman's face with the patient attention of a gardener watching for the first sign of a bud. "I think, Mrs. Prentice, that on the evening of the 18th of June you found reason to make an exception to your usual rule of staying clear of the study of an evening." The knife in Mrs. Prentice's hand paused, for the briefest of moments, above the pot of simmering fruit. It was not a large reaction. To an untrained eye it might have passed entirely unnoticed, but Miss Marple, who had spent a lifetime cataloguing precisely such small betrayals in the behaviour of otherwise composed people, saw it, and understood, in that instant, that her theory required no further confirmation. "I couldn't say, I'm sure," Mrs. Prentice said, resuming her stirring, her voice perfectly level. "It's not my place to go into the study of an evening." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently, "not as a rule, but I think, Mrs. Prentice, that on the evening of the 18th of June you found reason to make an exception. I think you brought him a tray, perhaps, a small kindness, nothing anyone would remark upon, a housekeeper looking in on her employer before she went home for the night, as I am told you sometimes did. And I think that while you were there you heard, or were told, what had passed that afternoon between Mr. Thorncastle and Mrs. Ashcombe, that he had confessed the truth of Monte Rossano, and been forgiven it entire, as though 9 years of a mother's grief could be so lightly set aside by anyone but the mother herself. And I think, Mrs. Prentice, that something in you that had been held very tightly in check for a very long time simply could not bear it 1 moment longer." For a long moment, Ivy Prentice said nothing at all, her hands still moving among the jars with the automatic competence of long habit, though her eyes, when at last she raised them to Miss Marple's face, held an expression of such raw and exhausted grief that Miss Marple felt for the first time in the whole course of the investigation something closer to sorrow than satisfaction at having found the truth. "My Tommy was 19, she said quietly. 19 years old, and he died screaming in a ditch in Italy because the man who was meant to lead him ran and hid instead. That's what the telegram said. Near enough, in its own careful words. 9 years I kept his house, and cooked his meals, and watched him grow old and comfortable and respected, while my boy never got past 19 at all. And then that woman comes to me in my own kitchen, not an hour after she'd left him, glowing like a girl, telling Mrs. Boothby, the postmistress's sister, how romantic it all was, how brave of him to confess, how she loved him all the more for having been so tested and found human. Found human. As if my Tommy's life was the test, and he'd passed it well enough by dying in his place. Chapter 19. The Reckoning Ivy Prentice's Confession, given quietly and without further resistance once the dam of 9 years' silence had broken, filled in the last remaining details with the flat, exhausted clarity of a woman who had, in some sense, been waiting a very long time to be caught. She had brought Thorncastle his evening tray at 9:30, as she sometimes did, and had found him alone, having already bid Miss Soloway good night. He had been, she said, in an unusually open and emotional mood, speaking almost to himself of the great weight lifted from him by Mrs. Ashcombe's forgiveness, of the future he now allowed himself to imagine. He had mentioned, in passing, the very name of the engagement where he had failed his men, Monte Rossano, never knowing, in his relief and his gratitude, that he spoke it to the mother of one of the boys who had died there. "I went cold all over," Mrs. Prentice said, "and then I went to fetch his glass and pour his whisky, as I had done 100 times before, quite automatic, my hands doing the work while my mind was somewhere else entire, back in that ditch in Italy, I think, though I've never seen it and never will. And there was a bottle of rat poison under the scullery sink, the kind with cyanide in it that Sam Gully uses for the moles in the vegetable garden, and I don't rightly remember deciding anything at all. I only remember my hand going to the cupboard, and then to the glass, and then I set the tray before him and wished him good night, and went home to my own cottage and slept. God forgive me, Miss Marple. I slept soundly that night, the first sound sleep I'd had in 9 years. She was arrested that same afternoon, and made no attempt whatsoever to deny what she had done before the magistrate, though she wept, briefly and without display, when the charge was read aloud, and her son's name was entered into the record alongside it. The first time, she said afterward to the wardress who attended her, that anyone in 9 years had spoken Thomas Prentice's name in a court of any kind at all. The village, learning of her arrest, greeted the news with an unease quite different from the eager appetite for scandal that had attended Sam Gully's confession or Dr. Merrow's debts. There was no relish in it, no satisfied sense of a mystery neatly resolved. Mrs. Ogilvy herself, who had produced so many colourful theories over the preceding fortnight, fell curiously silent on the subject of Ivy Prentice, and was heard by more than one witness to remark only that it was a hard thing, whatever she'd done, and she'd had a hard enough life before it, which passed, from Mrs. Ogilvy, for something very near sympathy. The formal charge was entered the following week, and Mrs. Prentice, by all accounts, met the proceedings with the same steady, capable composure she had brought to 9 years of managing another man's household, a composure that struck more than one observer in the courtroom as somehow more affecting than any display of grief could have been, precisely because it suggested a woman for whom the careful management of appearances had become, over so many years of necessity, very nearly the whole of her remaining self. Inspector Pollard, closing his notebook in Priscilla Danvers's sitting room that evening, over a tea that none of them had much appetite for, shook his head slowly. "I'd have looked at every soul in that village before I looked at the housekeeper," he admitted. "Devoted service, 9 years without complaint. It's the last place a man thinks to look for a motive." "That is very often precisely why it is the right place to look," said Miss Marple. "We assume that long service and quiet devotion are proof against violence, when in truth they are only proof of considerable self-control. And self-control, Inspector, exercised for 9 years over a grief as raw as hers, does not dissolve the grief. It only conceals it, very thoroughly, from everyone, including, I suspect, from Mrs. Prentice herself, until the moment came when concealment simply failed. Chapter 20. What Remained at Greymore. Little Hartsmere returned, in the weeks that followed, to something resembling its ordinary rhythms. The fete had been held, the church roof fund stood at a respectable £11, and rather more besides once the season's charitable impulse was properly stirred by tragedy, and the milkman resumed his rounds without incident. But an air of unease, subtle and lingering, remained over the village for a long while, as it does wherever the comfortable surface of a community has been shown, once and thoroughly, to conceal so many separate and private griefs beneath it. Beatrice Soloway remained at Greymore House only long enough to see the estate properly settled. Thorncastle, it transpired, had left a modest but sufficient legacy in her name, drawn up years before, a final quiet acknowledgement, perhaps, of a devotion he had never fully understood, before removing to a small flat in Lewes, where she was said to have taken up, at 50, the unlikely hobby of amateur astronomy, spending her evenings now, as Priscilla remarked with some wonder, looking outward at the stars instead of inward at a house full of secrets. Verity Ashcombe sold the mill cottage within the year and left the district altogether, though she wrote, it was said, a brief and kind letter to Miss Soloway before she went, in which the two women who had each loved Julian Thorncastle in such different ways found, at the last, a measure of unexpected understanding. Sam Gully was not prosecuted, the Crown taking the reasonable view that a foolish and desperate letter, never acted upon, hardly warranted the ruin of an old man's final years, and he continued to tend the Greymore gardens for the estate's new owners, though he never again, so Mrs. Ogilvy reported, kept his old regimental photograph anywhere but locked away in a drawer. Dr. Merrow, chastened rather more thoroughly by the events of that June than any court could have managed, was observed to give up the card tables altogether, and settled, in time, into a rather better reputation than he had held before. Greymore House itself passed, through a chain of distant cousins none of whom had known Julian Thorncastle in life, into the hands of a young family from London, who took down the iron gates within their first month of residence, and replaced them with a low wooden fence painted a cheerful white, and who were observed, that autumn, to host a great many visitors of an evening, laughter and lamplight spilling from every window of the house until well past midnight, precisely as if no lamp had ever burned there alone. Inspector Pollard, for his part, called on Priscilla Danvers's sitting room one final time before Miss Marple's departure, ostensibly to thank her for her assistance, though he stayed rather longer than the courtesy strictly required, and admitted, over a second cup of tea he had not been offered, but had somehow acquired regardless, that he had learned more about the proper conduct of an investigation in these 3 weeks than in the whole of the preceding decade. "You look for motive first, where I was taught to look for opportunity," he said. "I shall have to think on that, Miss Marple, the next time Fenbridge hands me something above its usual weight." "Opportunity tells you who could have done a thing, Inspector," Miss Marple said. "Motive tells you who very nearly had to. It is the second question, I find, that generally matters rather more, though it is a good deal harder to ask of people, since it requires them to speak honestly about their own hearts, which is a thing most of us manage only once or twice in a lifetime, and very often too late to do anyone much good. "It is always the way," Miss Marple observed to Priscilla, on her last evening in Little Hartsmere, before returning home to St. Mary Mead, the two of them sitting once more in the small sitting-room where the whole strange business had first been discussed over tea, that a single act of violence, however contained it may seem at the moment it occurs, sends its ripples through every life it has ever touched, however distantly. Mr. Thorncastle spent 11 years building walls around a single terrible afternoon in Italy, believing that if he simply kept the world out after dark, the past could never reach him. But grief, Priscilla, is not so easily locked out as that. It does not knock politely at the gate and wait to be admitted. It finds its way in through the kitchen door, disguised as a woman bringing an evening tray. And it waits, sometimes for years, for the one unguarded moment in which it can, at last, be heard. "And will you rest now, Jane? Truly rest, I mean, for the remainder of your visit?" Miss Marple smiled and took up her knitting once more, her needles finding their old familiar rhythm in the quiet of the summer evening. Outside, the last of the light was fading over the downs, and somewhere down the lane a lamp was being lit in a cottage window, an ordinary small flame against the coming dark, entirely unremarkable, entirely without secret, and all the more comforting for it. "I shall certainly try, my dear," she said, "though I have found, over a great many years, that peace tends to be rather harder to knit into a life than into a jumper. One drops a stitch here and there, however careful one means to be, and it is always, always the dropped stitches that show the end."